once again, on behalf of BasicSwap Dex, who is essentially hosting this Twitter space. Myself, I'll introduce. I'm Dr. Kapil Amarasinghe. I'm an advisor to the Particle Project, which is essentially the team that's building and helping to advance the technology behind the BasicSwap Dex. I'm co-joined by my hosts, Yanachar, who is one of the community leads for the PivX project, which is another sort of privacy-focused project, and Privacy Coin, who, as I mentioned, have been doing a lot of really interesting work in terms of zero-knowledge proofs and privacy with masternode setups. That's the stuff I personally find quite interesting. And we've also hopefully got Ruben from the Firo project joining us. Again, another major community advocate for the Firo project, which itself is a privacy coin, which I think they've done some really impressive work in terms of privacy technology, particularly worth looking into the Lelantus Spark protocol, which really is a very, I think the best way to say it is a very different way of doing privacy, but also a very effective way of doing privacy. And I just want to sort of say, us from the Particle Project, and we launched and operate as a proof of stake Bitcoin-based cryptocurrency that utilizes RingCT, which is the same privacy tech found in Monero. Collectively, we all use different sort of privacy technologies, but part of the reason we've sort of come together and coalesced is because we believe in the power of community, and we believe in the power of collaboration. I don't think you're going to find any maxis here, certainly in terms of mindset. We believe that technologies are synergistic. We believe that there's in my mind personally, there's no such thing as a redundant technology. I think having all of these different pathways really helps strengthen our space and creates resiliency in it. And as per the topic of today, which is the role of privacy, given the upcoming advent of CBDCs and given the regulatory frameworks. I know the plan from our end is to from the US side is there's been some recent stuff from the FinCEN, recent FinCEN directives that are basically saying privacy coins are bad, let's get rid of them. We don't want privacy coins to be involved in any sort of recognized cryptocurrency activity within the US, and you're getting similar-ish sort of recommendations from within the EU as well. So Yanachar, over to you, man. Any thoughts here? I would love to hear your perspective, certainly from the US point of view.
So we were talking, one of the things is the recent rulemaking proposed by FinCEN. Right? So we could discuss that a little bit. Just to give an overview, so FinCEN is part of the Treasury Department in the U.S. It stands for Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, I think, something like that. And the way they're part of the what FinCEN would like to do is they would like to designate mixers as what they call like a primary money laundering concern, and that has some significance in how like institutions in the U.S. have to track that data. So that's something that everybody's concerned about, and one reason they're concerned about it is there's still an opportunity to comment back to the Treasury Department on this. So anybody listening, it would be good to to look this up and give your thoughts. But it's really interesting what they're doing with it. They seem to be pushing an anti-crypto agenda, in the document, and you can look it up. It's all online. These rulemaking changes, they list concern with all the regular like bad guys out there, ISIS and North Korea. They're concerned about money laundering, Russian criminals. It's all mentioned in there. And interestingly, Hamas is mentioned in there, even though that's, they must have put them in really quickly after the.
I mean, it was a singular $3,000 transaction in Bitcoin that essentially got that listed against, I think, something like several $1 million of other assets and funding. There's definitely an agenda there. But I do apologize for the cutouts. I'm not entirely sure why we're having this. It's probably the first time we've encountered this issue on the numerous spaces we've had. I do want to thank everyone who's listening today, and I really want to just say I appreciate your patience whilst we kind of deal with these technical issues that seem to be somewhat out of our hands at the moment. Yen, you back?
I will say, while Yen comes back, Ruben might show up a little later. He had an issue that he had to urgently take care of.
Okay, that's fair enough. No. Well, whilst we're getting Yen back on, I think it's really interesting that that we would even have proposals that would automatically assume the role of a privacy mixer is money laundering. I think that's a very dangerous assumption to make. If there's anyone listening in the audience that has anything that they want to sort of add or say, or any questions they want to ask right now, this is a great time to kind of sort of pop your hands up and jump in.
In the meantime, I will ask, in your personal opinion, Cap, do you see that sort of characterization of mixers as a sort of an excuse to target mixers that are outside of centralized control? Or do you see this as a legitimate but sort of secondary valid attack?
I sort of see this as I think if you're making the assumption that the use of a technology is equivalent to the conduct of a crime, then you're in an extremely dangerous territory from any future legislative viewpoint, because you're saying that any future technology, the next step is from saying that a mixer is assumed by default to be a money laundering device, then the next step from that is that this could potentially, you're effectively saying this could potentially be used to launder money. So then the next step is to just outright ban the technology. Pragmatically, I don't think that's a very useful thing to do, because you can regionally restrict against a technology, but then there's nothing stopping another geographic location or region from restricting the use of that technology. So yeah, it might get banned in one country, but it doesn't stop the use of that in other countries. You could then extend to having, or somehow getting, an agreement on an international or even worldwide ban. But then if your underlying technologies, and I'm speaking specifically with privacy technologies, if they're good enough, then the use of privacy technologies, the ideal privacy technologies should be so good that their use is indistinguishable or cannot be detected. And I think actually that's part and parcel of the function of privacy technologies, is to strive towards a future whereby a privacy technology is so advanced, so sophisticated, that its use cannot be detected at all. And once you're at that stage, I don't think a regulatory framework, be that regional, national, international, or global, is going to make a damn difference. And I think actually what it's saying, if you pass such legislation or go down what I consider the slippery slope of such legislation, I think what you're getting into there is a really dangerous road of saying we're just outright banning technology, therefore we're outright banning ideas. Therefore, if you even think about this idea, it's not a huge stretch to get into that realm. If you even start thinking about these ideas, we're going to be paying very close attention to you. And yeah, we already see that in certain areas of research. And I think, certainly when it comes to technologies such as biological weapons, chemical weapons, any technology that can be directly weaponized, I can sort of understand the rationale for that, but I don't think privacy technology is something where the singular goal is direct weaponization. I think privacy technology serves many legitimate uses, particularly in the security space, particularly in terms of protecting users from abuse of authority, particularly in terms of protecting users from abuses of governments, abuses of institutions. So I think this is a really, really, really tricky road we're going down. I apologize for sort of speaking at length there, but that's the answer I can give you if that's the question you're asking me.
Yeah, I will say I personally view it as a sort of an ever recurring vector of attack, that's centralized policymaking. And there's a lot of different centers of policymaking, of course. It's sort of something that privacy projects sort of inherently have to defend against, and I'm sure you would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, you see it periodically. We've just had this in the UK, we've just had this with the online safety bill. There was a big campaign that was spearheaded by Signal. Now, just to give the context here for the online safety bill in the UK, they wanted to include provisions that would essentially allow the UK government, to have backdoor access would compel any company that was utilizing or building end-to-end encrypted technology in the UK, or deploying those technologies in the UK, it would compel those companies to build backdoors that the UK government could access. And big tech, I think the tech companies rightly pushed back. Apple pushed back, WhatsApp pushed back, Signal pushed back, and Signal certainly spearheaded a lot of the correspondence with the government here. I'll give credit to them for that. And actually, in the end, the UK government did wind up backing down a little, in a sense that they acknowledged that the ability to truly backdoor end-to-end encryption without weakening it significantly did not exist. And they kind of went with the, one day, if this technology does exist, whereby we can kind of get a backdoor into end-to-end encryption without significantly weakening it, or without breaking it, then we would do that. Whether that's actually possible or not is a different question. But what I'm trying to get at there is that, you've got two different drivers in society. You've got one driver which is highly focused on information sovereignty, because and that and at this moment in time, and I think and perpetually, I think, if you want to maintain true information sovereignty, and by that what I mean is, if you want true free flow of information, uninterrupted, uncensored, and I think that's the purest form of information, and uncensored information transmission as the purest form is going to have the freest form of expression. And if you want to have the freest form of expression, then I think it needs to be done within the private form. And I think there are people who realize that and will safeguard privacy, because fundamentally it safeguards freedom of speech. And if you don't have freedom of speech, you can't have free transmission of ideas. Therefore, you lose diversity of ideas. If you start losing diversity of ideas and thought, then essentially you're condemning your population to a form of constricted thought or group speak that will evolve over time. And if you get that, then you lose your population's ability to develop and adapt technologies that create resilience within our society. So I think there is a group of people who understand the fundamental value of privacy in terms of safeguarding free flow of information, in terms of safeguarding free flow of thought, and in terms of promoting diversity of thought, which in turn promotes the diversity and the development of technology. And if you don't have, and I think there are people who understand that extremely well, but at the same time, I think there are governments that are concerned about the security risks of not being able to see what everyone is saying. But I think there's a fundamental conflict there, in that governments themselves, they are not completely transparent in their discourse, but they expect everyone else to be. And I think that creates a massive conflict of interest. So that's where I think the origin of this problem lies.
Yes, and you could say CBDCs really, probably from the moment that they were articulated, really presented themselves as obviously anathema to the things that we're discussing right now.
Yeah, I find it extremely ironic that CBDCs have evolved from Bitcoin. The existence of CBDCs owes
Yes.
its existence to Bitcoin. Although if you look at uh, some of the documents that have come from some of the agencies, they barely acknowledge Bitcoin at all, except as possibly a tool for money laundering. I'm not going to specify which ones, but I have read them. We've discussed them in previous spaces. What I will say is that Bitcoin was a reaction to the 2007 and 8 financial crash. It was the recognition that fiat money, the issuance of fiat money, was controlled by central banks, and central banks worked in collusion with private banks, to set the parameters through which, and governments to set the parameters through which money was issued and interest rates are controlled. And yes, there's push and pull between those organizations, but ultimately, what was recognized with Bitcoin, or the people who created Bitcoin, was that the things that the events triggered by the 07-08 financial crash, specifically the use of taxpayer money to bail out banks, demonstrated that banks that had failed of the bank's own actions, i.e., the bankers and the employees of those institutions made fundamentally bad decisions that led to those banking institutions accruing huge debts that were unsustainable and unmanageable without a bailout from the government. And the government's response to that was to say, rather than let these failing institutions, who in a free market, unimpeded, or in a free market which did not have, which wouldn't, in a true free market, would not have access, should just be allowed to fail in principle. What happened was that the people who did lose out, i.e., regular Joe public voters, people, many of whom would have lost their homes or had foreclosures, many of whom lost tons of money, in various ways. Their stock market portfolios tanked, their pension portfolios tanked, they lost their homes. And the same group of people who were essentially the victims of what was bad management from these banks, the same group of people, the government basically said to them, we're going to basically take money out of your purse, i.e. the taxes you pay to us. Either we're going to raise them, or we're going to use funds from the tax revenue we've raised, i.e. we're going to charge you, the people who have suffered from this crash, to bail out these institutions that have failed through their own actions. And I think the people who created Bitcoin, ultimately, the people who created that realize, we need to separate money from state. I think that's a really powerful and fundamental driver here. There was an implicit recognition that money and state had to be separate entities. Much like, the US, one of the things I really love is there is a clear impetus there to separate religion from state. And I think separating money from state was the recognized focus of Bitcoin. Now, what's happened was that, Bitcoin was initially touted as an anonymous cryptocurrency. When it originally came out, if you happen to be aware of it in 2010, 2011, 2012, you would see where it was being advertised. This is an anonymous form of money. No one can trace it. What wasn't factored in and what wasn't really made clear was actually with Bitcoin, you had transactions occurring on a public ledger. And yes, they were from, very long hexadecimal string type addresses to other very long indecipherable hexadecimal type string addresses. But what wasn't made clear was, although it looked like an anonymous jumble of flows, actually it was very possible, because it was a public ledger and the flow of those transactions is publicly viewable. What wasn't made clear was that actually you could trace those flows, and blockchain analytics firms sprung up, and they kind of proved that you could look at this address and see that it was linked to this centralized exchange account. So you could see at this point in the transaction change, something happened where it was cashed out to fiat, or it was cashed out to another cryptocurrency, or it went to this specific address, or it went to this person. So over time, you went from the 2011, 12, arguably 13 era, you start approaching the years 2014, 15, 16, blockchain analytics firms are a lot more embedded, they're developed, they're a lot more advanced. And now we're acknowledging that Bitcoin is no longer anonymous. We're acknowledging that it's pseudo-anonymous, i.e. it looks like it provides an anonymous chain of transaction flows, but it doesn't. And then when you go from that, now where we're getting to is Bitcoin rose in value a shit ton, because the original premise of separation from money and state, that was recognized by lots of people who bought into that narrative, who recognized the implicit value of digital gold that was independent of a function of the state. And people bought into that, and that caused the value of Bitcoin, that caused the amount of liquidity, i.e. the amount of value flowing, transaction value and social transaction value flowing through Bitcoin, increased enormously when that awareness came about. So as a result, governments now realized here is an existential threat, or a potential emerging existential threat to the sovereignty of our currencies, the sovereignty, and by extension, the sovereignty of our nations. And that's what happened, was the governments looked at this and said, yeah, oh my God, this is getting really successful. What do they do? What do we do to preserve ourselves? Because the function of government, much like the function of any institution or organization that is established and mature, and this applies to human beings, grown adults, children, anything, the first function is the function of self-preservation. So governments looked at this emerging self-sovereign currency that was independent from states, Bitcoin, and they went, hang on a minute, this is a threat to us existentially. How do we respond? And they looked at the fact that Bitcoin was pseudo-anonymous, i.e. it was a public blockchain and traceable, and said, you know what, we can take something from this, we can co-opt something from this, and that is the nature of publicly traceable blockchains. And actually, here's something useful here for us to allow us to perpetuate ourselves and for us to preserve ourselves. And that's where we're at, is CBDCs.
Yes. I do believe we do have Yam back, and I would love to hear his thoughts on this.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Yes. So, all those are excellent points, Dr. Cap, and I agree that it feels like a lot of what's happening with governments in the U.S. I mean, to some degree, this, like talking about money laundering and so forth, feels a little bit like cover for wanting power and control, as you mentioned. It's a concern for sovereignty and control, and I think an important so we can expect this to continue, right? Isn't that reasonable? The governments, the U.S., the UK, Europe, they're going to continue to assault cryptocurrency, and they're going to assault like private cryptocurrencies that we love. And the question in my mind, though, is how does it play out in success or failure? We're all clearly rooting for success of private cryptocurrency. It's important, for all the reasons we discussed. It empowers the individual. It kind of preserves what are fundamental human rights in code. But how does it unfold? So the governments keep piling on new laws, and cryptocurrency keeps like evolving and trying to survive. But what happens in the future? I mean, what's the end game in how this unfolds, and why? I think is an interesting question. If we look forward, what's going to happen? And I mean, I have some thoughts. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Okay. If I could go at length on this, but I'll kind of keep it brief, because I'll keep it as brief as I can. I have a cynical take on this.
Okay.
Which is that the cynical. I have a cynical take and an optimistic take, and they coexist.
Okay.
So both of these things I think are going to happen. I'm going to start with the cynical take on this. My cynical take on this is that this applies to the optimistic take as well. I think privacy coins will always survive. It just comes down to which institution co-opts them as part of their own, and which institution co-opts them to become the dominant financial center of privacy-focused commerce. So that's kind of my viewpoint. And what I mean by that is I look at what was Swiss banking, and I look at the client base for Swiss banking traditionally, which is high-end politicians. And this is the cynical take. This is all about essentially dirty money and laundering. Okay. And this is the thing that governments are openly say they're worried about, but there are figures within those governments that want this. They want, that we cannot deny the existence of Swiss banking. We can't deny the existence of offshore banking. We can't deny the existence of tax evasion/evasion via the use of traditional private banking facilities.
Right.
And I think with that in mind, I think if you roll out CBDCs, what you're essentially going into is a two-tier banking system. From my perspective, I see a two-tier banking system emerging for the ultra wealthy and elite who may get some of, and not all of them, I'm not saying everyone, but I suspect there will be a portion within the ultra wealthy and elite who are going to have and want ongoing access to highly private, highly private means of storing their liquidity. And I think there are legitimate reasons for that as well. You don't want to be the billionaire whose liquid cash is on a publicly viewable CBDC blockchain, because everyone can see where your money is on that blockchain and everyone can see exactly where it's going. And the interesting thing is, as soon as you can see where your money is, you can kind of start doing chain analysis to start linking that to, it comes down to, if every time you convert that to cash, or every time you convert that into some other form of liquidity, i.e. purchases of stocks, bonds, shares, or other assets, there are ways to then trace that. So you as an independent person in that network, you are making yourself extremely exposed and vulnerable to your competitors and to people who might be trying to harm you in some way. So I think, this is where it's less cynical, but within the cynical world, I think there is a very legitimate use. There will always be a legitimate place in the world for privacy-focused cryptocurrencies. And I think within the most cynical part of myself, what I'm trying to say is, I think CBDCs will be used to screw over the little guy. I think they'll be used to screw over the majority of people who don't happen to be in the 1% or 0.1% wealth brackets in that range. And I think CBDCs will be used to monitor and track and trace the financial inflows and outflows of almost the entire planet, if allowed to be deployed universally. And I think that will be used for things like automated taxation and tax resolution. I think that will be part of it. I also think it will be used for literally, I suspect governments will start selling off users' spending habits and data to private firms as a means of bolstering their own coffers. So I think the majority of end users for CBDCs, they're going to lack any kind of financial privacy. I think they're going to be vulnerable to automated taxation, which may be unfair and illegal automated taxation. I think they're going to be vulnerable to sanctions, which may be illegal or legal, and which may be ethical or unethical. So I think, and sanctions, and I mean censorship, and by that I mean straight out account closures and disconnection from the financial system.
So for the survival of privacy coins, you see a two-tier system. I can see that. There's a two-tier system going forward where there's the CBDC, or the traditional financial system, which is completely in agreement with governments and so forth. And then there's like a dark money side, or a second, a sub-tier. And it's easy to move money, just so I have this vision right. It's easy to move money from the first tier into the second tier, or easier. You can go buy, you might have to go, to somebody on the corner, or find some site online, but you can get money maybe with some difficulty from the first tier into the second tier, but it's harder to get money back into the first tier. Would that be a fair statement? There's difficulty in moving money back and forth.
Well,
And I think there's a precedent for that. If you look at the way things, even in the cryptocurrency space, you see people talking about, well, how much of your Bitcoin is KYC and how much is non-KYC? And so there's almost like a two-tier, like Bitcoin, right? There's two tiers already in the financial system. There's people carrying around suitcases of cash, right? And there's people doing wire transfers. So it's a good model, I think, because it has a historical precedent.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. I think what's going to happen is you are going to see space for. I think what I was getting at with Swiss banks is I kind of see privacy coins and the privacy coin and privacy. I refer to this as the privacy liquidity ecosystem, which is just that sphere of liquidity, that sphere of transactions and value flow that is entirely private. At the moment, that is handled by, that has been, famously handled, but within centralized world of fiat by, Swiss banking. You think Cayman Islands, you think of places like Panama, Cayman Islands, Isle of Man, to a lesser extent, I think of Singapore. That there are various nations that you kind of associate as being hubs for for ensuring the privacy of assets, or for safeguarding the privacy of assets. And they have associated reputations with, they do have their reputations in terms of tax evasion, money laundering, blood money. There are negative connotations to that, but then there are also very legitimate connotations, which is fundamentally about security and personal safety, and also about kind of securing one's assets from against bad actors. I think there is room for that system of private fiat money to evolve into a system of private, decentralized, digital liquidity, so digital currency.
Are there closed economies just in the second tier of money? I mean, whether it's a country or it's places. I mean, can you just do business in this second tier?
I see it as a holding ground where large and important. In my mind, I see this as a holding ground where very large sums of money are held, very large sums of value of money are held, and they are traded by smaller. And this is the thing. In my optimistic vision, I see. I'll get to the optimistic vision, but in the cynical world that I perceive, I see this as a sphere which is traditionally occupied by the same people who use the existing private banking system, and it's the same types of people, it's the same categories, it's the same profile, same intention, same use cases. And I'm genuinely not judging them. What I'm trying to say is I see them conducting their business that they would have done previously. They would conduct the same business in this digitized sphere. What you basically see is an evolution from your fiat cash printed money being stored in vaults, or your gold bars being stored in vaults, to your digitized, CBDC equivalents, this private money being stored on private wallets, engaging in private transactions which are immune to third-party chain analysis, which are immune to third-party observers looking and going, oh, I can see the money in this wallet has gone to this wallet and this wallet, so I can see this person has transacted with this person and this person. What I see is this system of liquidity where you just know there's a sum total value of transaction flow in this network. You know the rough values of the coins that this network is trading in, so you know the rough total market cap of this liquidity sphere, but you don't really know what's going on inside it. It's just a black box. And I see that as a significant evolution of Swiss banking. I see that as a huge evolution of Swiss banking, and the sort of offshore banking systems that you see in the Isle of Man and other places. So I see that, and I see the same activities and the same actors, and I see that being a driver. And when we talk about drivers, I mean, I'm talking about people of wealth and influence. They will always want this. There will always be a segment of them that will always want this, for many of the reasons I've just outlined.
And for like historical basis, they're using it now. You're right. So the cynical view is it taking over that kind of dark money like side that's already existing. What's the optimistic view?
The optimistic view, and we've discussed this before, is actually, as I've said, the fundamental premise of privacy is freedom. Like, that is what it safeguards. And I think as you become more enlightened to how public money works, and this is something that a lot of my, just to those who don't know, my background is in emergency medicine. I work as a consultant, a doctor, for the last 15 years, and I've been a consultant for several now. A lot of my professional colleagues outside of cryptocurrency, they are now starting to learn how money works. These are people, many of whom are 10, 15 years older than me, but they're being forced to learn how money really works out of necessity, because right now we're dealing with conflicts that are driving an inflationary spiral. Certainly within the UK, we have a combination factor of Brexit and also wars in Ukraine, and now the war in Israel, Israel-Palestinian war, that's sort of flaring up. And COVID, the pandemic itself, all of those factors have disrupted supply chains, they've disrupted energy supply chains, and they've led to huge, sudden, massive costs, rises in the cost of living for many people in the UK who would have traditionally identified with the middle class. And that's had a disproportionately higher impact on people in the working class, by the way. So a lot of people are now suffering, and this has happened very suddenly. We're talking in the space of, I'd say, less than 15 months now. And it's an accelerating process. And the reality is, as conflict escalates and spreads, those supply chain disruptions are going to get worse. Therefore, the inflationary pressures, i.e. the cost of living pressures, are going to get worse. Now, where I live, and in our country, we're seeing waves and waves of people striking in the public sectors and in the public service sectors for pay rises in response to this. And that's not, that is going to help. You see the government pushing back on that, because they're afraid that if we put up prices, if we put up wages, people are just going to go back to spending, and that's not going to ease the demand. But I think what the government's fundamentally understanding, and I will get back to my point here, the government's misunderstanding is actually we need to fix our supply chain issues. We need to strive towards energy independence, food independence, etc., in order to fix this inflationary problem we have. Now, people around me, they're starting to understand those concepts of inflation. They're starting to understand basic economic and financial concepts better. And they're starting to understand that you're getting greater curiosity about the nature of money and the nature of value and the nature of flow and the nature of governments, because out of necessity, because people are questioning why. Going back to my colleagues, these are people who've worked 15, 20, 30 years in the health service. A lot of the guys who've becoming consultants in the last year or two, they will have taken a route that would have started around 15 years ago at minimum to get there. And they're suddenly now entering positions where their monthly mortgage payments have doubled, and they're struggling financially to just stay afloat. We're talking, this is the lose your home. We're now in top of your full-time job, you're now having to take on additional shifts and on top of their full-time job just to keep the mortgage payments, just so they don't lose their homes, just so their families don't go homeless. That creates a lot of pressures that's having an effect on us in terms of a lot of my colleagues are now leaving the country and going to places which simply pay better, but also it's also forcing them out of necessity to better understand their financial circumstances. And amongst
where
those,
are
you're
they
seeing
going?
people,
Are they going to continental Europe, or where are they going?
the main drivers are towards, at the moment, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Middle East, particularly like UAE, Qatar.
Okay.
The US as well is getting a
Okay.
couple. I could talk about this as a different topic,
No,
but
just curious.
these are
Where
simple.
they're going.
Southeast Asia, so places like Singapore, these are all places that are attractive to British postgraduate, to emerging, to British graduates in medicine, and certainly to emerging consultants. You've got countries that are actively poaching our doctors, because they're simply offering much better quality of life,
Right.
much
Sure.
better pay, much lower costs of living. But those of us who are staying, this doesn't affect me. I've been in crypto for a long time, and my circumstances are different. But for those who are staying, who are potentially forced to, are they staying for ideological reasons or because they're forced to stay due to family commitments? They're suddenly realizing that the government has fed them a lie. This is how I say it, that they've been fed a myth. And this is the same myth that I was fed, which was that, grow up, work hard at school, study, get the best grades you can, go to university, do as well as, ideally go into a university, get a good vocational degree. I was encouraged to go into medicine. And when you get into medicine, work through the system, work as hard as you can, be the best doctor you can be, get to the consultant level, and your life is set. You don't have to worry. What's happening is 15 years. And by the way, when I completed med school, my student debt was around £27,000. I was on large loans because I actually came from my family weren't that well off when at the time I'd gone to med school, so that was my debt. Now, if you complete med school in the UK, your expected debt, if you were in my financial position, is at least £100,000, and that is in the space of 15 years. In the same time, real terms wages for consultants have gone down 30% when corrected against inflation.
Yeah, it's strange that we keep getting new technology and efficiency improvements, and yet it seems like more of a struggle. So does like better money address this? Is that the optimistic?
There are much deeper problems within the National Health Service, which relate to 13 years of systemic underfunding post-austerity. The 07-08 financial crisis, it was a case of, when I go back to the governments took taxpayers' money to bail out banks, they also stopped spending on any real investment on roads, schools, water supply, essential utilities, healthcare. They really cut back spending in a huge way on the core infrastructure to maintain these services, on a background of increasing demand on these services, on a background of a changing demographic. Our elderly population is getting larger and larger, and our working population is getting smaller and smaller. So we are very much seeing the effects of our demographic shifts at play here as well, on a backdrop of inflationary pressures. So that, just to answer your question, higher salaries will help retention, but it won't fix the underlying problem. Actually, if you want my honest answer, one of the best fixes you could do for that is to double salaries for carers, who work in social care, in nursing homes and residential homes, because that would fix some of our backlog issues. There are other things I could talk about, but what I'm trying to say with this massive detour is that actually, the optimistic case for private money, it comes down to separation of state and money, which is that because they're so deeply intertwined, when something goes wrong with when something goes wrong with government policy, it has a direct impact on the money supply and the value of money for that nation. That's the underlying problem here. And if you have an enlightened, well-educated government that understands the principles of investing in self-sufficiency and investing in infrastructure that makes a country truly independent, truly able to support itself, independent of external trade, independent of importing. So if you make a country energy independent, if you make it food independent, you're fixing most of the major liquidity and supply issues for that country. And I don't think the UK government truly understands that, certainly if you look at the policies it's implemented. And that the knockback on that is the currency has devalued objectively. Pre-Brexit, it was trading at a high of $1.50 to the, it was $1.50 to the pound. It's now, it went to the lows of $1.08 and it's kind of sitting around $1.20 to the pound. If you look back 15 years ago, it was almost $2.
Of course, the dollar has gone down in value too.
The dollar has gone down in value. And because of what I've highlighted to you, which is the results of underinvestment, which has a direct effect on your ability to support your supply chains, has a direct effect on the liquidity within your economy. That in turn, liquidity is just exchange of ideas, free flow of information. The best example I can give you is, for me to get to St Pancras in central London on a train would take me about an hour and 15 minutes. But I can tell you right now, if I was to buy an open return ticket, that would cost me about £120, which is the cost of taking a taxi to the airport and getting a flight on EasyJet via Ryanair to Morocco, a return flight to Morocco. To do a whole return journey to Morocco is the same price as getting an open return to London. Now, if you think about that, this is real fundamentals right now. If you think about that on a liquid, and sorry we're going so off topic, but if you think about this, if you imagine there's an artist or maybe an entrepreneur that's based, somewhere in the middle of England, say, in the Birmingham area or in the Manchester area or Leeds or Liverpool, and if you think all of the, if there's a huge concentration of businesses, of resource, it's all in London. You may have the world's most talented person somewhere in the middle of nowhere, but if they have to spend £300 to just get into central London to do the meeting, to then kickstart their idea, that's not going to happen. That's a direct restriction on liquidity. So what I'm trying to say to you is liquidity is about easing the free flow of ideas and information, and that means the transit of information. Privacy is not just one aspect of that. Speed and ease of access is another aspect that's fundamental to liquidity as well. So that's kind of these are the lessons I've learned because I've gotten into cryptocurrency. Funnily enough, 8 years, getting into cryptocurrency, studying markets and really thinking about how this stuff works on a philosophical level and having some background in business has allowed me to get to this level. But what I'm trying to say to you is people are starting that exploration, and the further you go down that exploration, the more you realize the value of private money, and the more you realize the value of privacy-focused solutions as a safeguard, because you're realizing that, if you have publicly traceable currencies, you can never truly achieve separation of state from money. That's the fundamental premise we're talking about here. So Bitcoin,
because the government watches it and gets involved.
Exactly.
That
exactly.
Makes sense. Mm-hmm.
So
and also, I agree completely with your take. It's amazing how an interest in cryptocurrency broadens one's horizons, and you start to see money in a completely different way, isn't it? It's an educational process.
Yeah. And this is where I'm optimistic, is that people are learning about cryptocurrency. And you can't really understand cryptocurrency without ultimately learning this stuff. This is stuff that just eventually comes over time,
right.
to really get into, to really go, why are we doing it? People, the majority of people who get into cryptocurrency in bull cycles, they're just essentially gambling. Let's be honest. They're looking to make a quick buck because they think this thing's going to go up in value. They're not thinking about it deeper. But within that cohort, you've got people who are like, hang on a sec, what is this? And they start looking, and then they go down that rabbit hole and get to where, we are having the discussion that we're having, happy enough to be in a room with all the people listening to it. And once you get to that level, you're free as far as I'm concerned, because these systems for private money exist. You know how to protect yourself from the state, the inefficiencies of the state, the failures of the state, the mistakes of the state. And that's what private money is about. It's about separation of state from money. And it's about having a system where you can be protected from the excesses of the state and from the abuses of the state and the mistakes of the state. Because as I said, it's the mistake, as far as I'm concerned, it is the mistakes of the UK government that have led to not only the devaluation of the pound against the dollar, but to massive rises in interest rates, which are now causing huge knock-on effects on the cost of living of my professional colleagues who are now leaving the country to find other places. That's causing a brain drain, which has a negative effect on liquidity because you're suddenly losing talent. They're going to where the opportunity is, where they can see a place to grow.
Brain drain is a killer. Yes.
It's a killer. So these negative liquidity effects, they self-perpetuate, and positive liquidity effects perpetuate. I truly believe privacy coins, when they are fully understood, will create a huge self-perpetuating network effect. It will take time to get there. We'll need to deploy the right technologies to do it.
I agree with that. There will be network effects, and I think I like your optimistic perspective, and that network effect is what would allow even your cynical view to turn into the optimistic one. Let's say that that like private cryptocurrency takes over the role that like gold and Swiss banks traditionally have had. If there's closed economies around that, and private cryptocurrency is actually better money, the separation of money from state leads to better outcomes. With time, those closed systems will grow to dominate the other systems that are stuck with just tier one money. So that's the path from even your cynical perspective to the optimistic one, right? Yeah. So I would, based on your presentation of those two sides, I lean towards the optimistic outcome since there's a path to it from the other side.
I mean, I'm going to make it as an example, just for how free flow of information and having a degree of privacy can really protect. I'm going to go back to my teenage years. I'm going to use the example of someone I know. This person that I happen to know, he grew up in a very poor family. He didn't actually have this person didn't have their first music album, I think, until the age of 15, 16, because at that time, I think the album, just buying a whole single album cost about £15, which is like $20 for a single album. It was a big spend. Mm-hmm. And then, about probably a year later, LimeWire and Kazaa came out, and the torrent services started emerging. And I think this person, by their sort of mid-20s, had managed to listen to like thousands of albums that person would never have been able to have afforded. And that experience of being able to access all of that information helped, that diversity of information really helped grow that person as an individual, gave them a rich body of experiences to look back on. And so I think the free flow of information is really important. And I think private money is going to facilitate that free flow. I am a firm fundamental believer in that. And I think when people understand, I think people are going to need to see the adverse effects of CBDCs in practice. And I think by the time those things are deployed, I think a lot of our private money ecosystem is going to be very mature by that point. And I think it's going to offer a legitimate gateway, a legitimate escape from the matrix into a world where ideas and information and resource can be shared and communicated and exchanged in a much more free way. And I think the consequence of that is that existing governments whose prime directive is not I don't believe their prime directive is the representation of people. That's their secondary directive. Their prime directive as an institution is the preservation of themselves, of government. People are working to preserve themselves. So I think governments who are acting in the best interests of self-preservation and will respond to the forces that help preserve them, when they see this private liquidity ecosystem take off, and when they see that all of the meaningful and real economic activity and idea exchanges happening on it, yes, they will. They're already feeling threatened. They're already trying to react. That's why we've got the FinCEN rules coming. We've got these proposals. But that's why you see the EU doing exactly what it's doing. Because on a very small-minded level, you've got figures and politicians here who are seeing it as a threat fundamentally to their own jobs. That is the reality of this. This is a threat to people's jobs, people who have vested self-interests, and they are trying to maintain. And these are people who are maintaining their self-interest in institutions. They're ultimately the people who bailed out big banks at the expense of taxpayers and precipitated a liquidity crisis that we have now, a global liquidity crisis. The current inflationary crisis, the current supply chain crisis, this has all been perpetuated. All the problems that you're seeing in this is me going on, and it's a bit of a stretch, but a lot of the problems you're seeing in the US, certainly I can say the problems you're seeing in the UK, are the consequences of decisions that were made 14 in 2007 following this 07-08 crash. They were the direct consequence of that. And that is a broken ideology that will try and preserve itself to its last dying breath. That is how I feel. And it will fight. And that is what we're seeing now. We're seeing that fear. We're seeing that self-preservation kick in, because at the end of the day, these guys think they're early enough to stop us. That's genuinely what I feel. But I think the technology has kind of gotten, and it's not quite there. It's
They're not
really
early
not
enough to
there.
stop us, I don't think.
But yeah.
I think one of the part of the phenomenon of cryptocurrency is it's always in a state of costing more to stop than it's worth to the people who would stop it. It's been that way from the very beginning. I believe it's still in that state. I don't think they're early enough to stop us.
And that's why we have CBDCs now. That's genuinely why they couldn't. And that was their only response, was to create a clone of Bitcoin.
Right. Yep. I agree. Well, let's see. We're coming up, Dr. Cap, on the hour. Should we see if I don't know if others, if the participants would have input? Let's see.
If anyone would just want to sort of speak, this is a great time. We are open to the floor. That's fair enough. Obviously, a private community.
Right.
Yeah. Cangrejo, do you have any thoughts?
I will say, I think it transpired while you guys were having this discussion that CBDCs and regulations really do in the end go hand in hand, and it is an appropriating of blockchain technology, of course, in ways that obviously go against privacy projects. And we had a tweet about that yesterday, actually, that it really enshrines the role of privacy projects, that we need to expect that vector of attack, and it needs to be mathematically sort of backed, that we're not really giving governments an option to contend with privacy or not. It's about resilience in the face of what we need to consider as inevitable encroachment.
But through regulatory efforts.
Yeah, which I think are inevitable, or at least need to be treated as such.
Right, they're inevitable. So what are steps that should be taken to gain that robustness? do you think?
I mean, I think within the EU, the European Human Rights Act, it enshrines the right to privacy. So on a very fundamental level, you've got your challenge there, certainly within the sphere of the EU. I don't know enough about US legislature to know where to start.
Well,
with
the
this.
U.S. has like enshrined in the Bill of Rights, which is supreme law of the land. It's an amendment to the Constitution that there's privacy and personal effects. So we do have that. I guess those rights to fall back on and to push in the courts. Is that?
I think that would be your starting point then, because I think any bill that presupposes or threatens to presuppose that the use of technology is equal to the abuse of that technology, or simply the existence of that technology is equal to the abuse of that technology, any bill, certainly within where that relates to privacy, I would challenge it on a very fundamental constitutional ground.
Right.
And I think that's the way is you've got to rally people. You've got to write to, I guess in the US it would be congressman. In the UK, not in the UK. In the UK it would be your member of parliament. In the EU it would be your member of European Parliament. And you need to engage with those authorities. You need to educate them. And if they pass laws that are illegal, then those laws need to be challenged in the courts. And you need to work with your respective organizations. Again, in the UK, that would be Liberty is a really good organization to work with. And actually, I think that applies to the EU to some extent as well. I'm not entirely sure which organizations from the US point of view I would sort of reach out to, but I'm sure there are a few.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Amazing. Unfortunately, we couldn't get Ruben here in time. It's a shame, because I would have really loved to hear what he had to say about all of this.
Yeah, but I think, you know what, it's weird. Thank you. I'm glad I got to say what I had to say. I hope to those
good
listening.
insights.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's really stuff I've thought about for a while, and it's nice to kind of get out onto platforms like this and just to be able to say what I'm thinking with again, Yenachar, thanks for just taking the time to listen to me, because I don't get to share this level or this depth of insight very often. It's just stuff I think about.
Awesome.
So,
yeah.
This is just how I kind of view the world. I'm glad we got this recorded. If we can just kind of push it out to our respective communities and our respective channels, just so that they can kind of listen back to the recording. Because I think, it's one thing for us to have these discussions, but it is important that we get the content and the ideas out there as much as possible, because that's how you're going to make that change, and that's how you're going to actually push the private liquidity ecosystem as well. And that's how we're going to push the vision of the future, which I think is a better one. I genuinely do.
Mm-hmm. Good. Right. And the action is to push back in the courts, push back for the rights that are already enshrined in the way our governments are set up.
I'm good personally. If no one on the floor.
Good.
Oh, does anyone want to speak?
Last chance to raise your hand. Well, again, a lot of great clips in here for sure, and Dr. Cap and Yen, I always love hearing your perspectives on something I think is very defining for the last 20 years, maybe even.
Yeah. Yes. No. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. And again, Yen and Cangrejo, thank you, and also to Ruben and those listening, thank you so much for hosting this space. It's been a real pleasure as always.
Amazing. I hope everybody has a good day.
Yep.